Hello, everybody. This is Howie Hawkins. I was a Green Party candidate and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and organize and advocate around the eco-socialist platform that Angela Walker and I ran on. So what I thought I'd do today is just kind of talk about where the Greens and Green Socialists in particular are in the current political context. It looks like Trump may, reach the end of his line with all the things going on. There are over 20 investigations and lawsuits, but the highlights are the illegal possession of classified documents, the penalties for which that orange idiot increased while he was in office. Now it's coming back to bite him. We got tape recordings of the Georgia election fraud where he asked for 11,000 something more votes to flip Georgia in his column. And then Attorney General of New York State, Tish James, just announced a civil lawsuit against Trump, his children, and the Trump organization for tax, insurance, and bank fraud. And they got the documents. This guy may finally be toast. And that doesn't mean we're out of the woods with Trumpism, because the Republicans will come up with another crazy right winger like DeSantis out of Florida. And meanwhile, in the midterms, the Republicans are running election deniers for Congress, state governors, attorneys general, and secretaries of state. And if the Republican election deniers take full control of some of these states, we've lost fair and honest elections in those states. And if the Republicans take over Congress in the midterms, the anti-green sentiment coming from the spoiler effect is going to be stronger than ever. So the national political dynamic is that progressive-minded people feel compelled to vote defensively for neoliberal corporate Democrats in order to stop the neo-fascist, anti-democratic, small d, anti-democratic Republicans. And it makes it very hard for Greens to compete, particularly, of course, at the presidential level, but also congressional and state executive and legislative offices. So the spoiler problem is stronger than it's ever. It's always been a problem for us, but with the Republicans moving so far to the right, it's worse than ever. So the question is, what can we do in this situation? Well, the first thing I think is we need to keep fighting for ranked choice voting, and particularly proportional ranked choice voting for legislative bodies. That eliminates the spoiler problem. And even if we don't have it, talking about it in an election is a way to blunt that argument against us and challenge particularly the Democrats running if they will support ranked choice voting and proportional ranked choice voting for the legislatures. And if they say yes, we can say, hey, the Greens made a difference. If they say no, we can shame them for supporting an exclusionary winner-take-all plurality voting system that basically magnifies pluralities or small majorities into enormous majorities and eliminates political minorities from any influence in elected government. So that's the first thing. We got to keep fighting for those election reforms. The second thing is, despite the spoiler problem, most districts are one-party districts. One of the major parties dominates. So the spoiler effect really isn't in play there. And we can make education about this district that we're running in not being, the spoiler effect won't come into play because it's been dominated by one party. You can vote over and over and over again, and that major party in that district is going to win. 90% of congressional districts are non-competitive one-party districts. 95% of state legislative districts are non-competitive districts. Most local districts, we have lots of cities where all the elected officials are Democrats. We have rural areas where the Republicans are the only people ever get elected, which means if the Greens run in those races, we're automatically the second party because urban Democrats and rural Republicans don't run serious campaigns and often don't run any campaign at all. In fact, 40% of the elected offices in this country in any election don't have an opposition. The incumbent is getting reelected. And in some cases, they're looking for somebody to fill the office, particularly for things like boards of election or boards of education, and but even sometimes town councils. So there are lots of opportunities for us to run. And in these one-party districts, the spoiler effect is not so much in play, but we still should be fighting for proportional ranked choice voting. Should be a top issue. It not only eliminates the spoiler issue, it eliminates gerrymandering, which is what creates these non-competitive one-party districts, which, particularly the progressives who are thinking they got to vote defensively for Democrats to stop the Republicans are concerned about, because the Republicans got the jump on gerrymandering in 2000 and particularly 2010, and they still are benefiting from that legacy, even though the Democrats tried to play catch up this time and had some success, but not enough to overcome what the Republicans did in 2010. So, the election system is biased toward the Republicans in a lot of states. And ranked choice voting, proportional representation for legislative bodies, it eliminates gerrymandering because they're multi-party, multi-member districts, and every political viewpoint gets its proportional share of representation based on its vote. So it doesn't matter so much where you draw the district lines. Everybody's going to get their proportional share of representation. And gerrymandering is just can't create these one-party non-competitive districts. So that's the second thing. We should fight for electoral reforms, proportional ranked choice voting, run in these one-party districts and point that out, that the spoiler effect that everybody's concerned about, because that's sort of the national political narrative, doesn't really affect this district that we're running in. And the third thing is to run in local races. There are 505,000 elected offices in this country, and they often are unopposed. I said 40% of candidates or races in elections nationwide are unopposed, and sometimes lacking candidates. And Greens historically have won a high percentage of these local races they run in. I couldn't find a percentage, but Mike Feinstein, who keeps the elections database, he has the number. I think it's around 1/3 of the races we've run. So, it's not like we're just in there raising issues. We can be competitive in these races. And since 1985, when the first Greens ran, we've won 1,351 of these races, including 261 that were partisan races. Now, a lot of local elections in many states are nonpartisan, which reduces the spoiler effect. And we should be running in those, but we should be running as Greens. And in fact, in a lot of the so-called nonpartisan races, everybody knows who the Democratic and who the Republican candidates are. So it's only just on the ballot they don't put the party label. We currently have 125 people in office. What we should be doing is expanding that to thousands. And that way we can create an alternative to the Democrats, who are not stopping the fascist Republicans. They're adapting to them. They failed to take on a filibuster in order to get voting rights and election protection legislation passed to preempt what the Republicans are doing in the states they control. And instead of fighting the Republicans, they adapt to them. Biden still pursues bipartisanship with the party, the Republican Party, that tried and is still trying in some quarters to overthrow his election. They're adapting to the Republicans' law and order rhetoric around the crime issue. And, Biden's put out all this money for more police at the federal level. They've been adapting to the Republicans on climate and their fossil fuel backers. Build Back Badly, which is what I call the Inflation Reduction Act, is really a bill mostly for the fossil fuel industry. And the Democrats are declaring victory when they got their ass kicked. And they're adapting to the GOP and Trump on COVID. On 60 Minutes, I guess it was last Sunday, Biden said the pandemic is over. Yeah, we have over 400 people dying every week in this country. We have about 25,000 people hospitalized with COVID on any given day. And the Biden administration and other public epidemiologists are predicting 100 million cases this coming winter. Yeah, that's a third of the country. For some, it'll be more, a second infection, but that's a pandemic. And instead, like Trump, Biden is pandering to the public that's tired of COVID, even if COVID isn't tired of us. And it's promoting public complacency, which makes the pandemic worse. And he said it when COVID funding is before Congress here, before they break to, finish their campaigns for the midterms. And he's undermining that by saying, no, COVID's not an issue. And right away, the Republicans picked up on that and said, yeah, it's not an issue. Biden said so. So we don't need to fund public health measures concerning COVID. So, I said they're adapting to the Republicans. You could say they're aping the Republicans. That might be a better description. So, that's all to say that we need a green socialist movement because we can fight the fascists better than the Democrats. The question for the Greens and any independent socialists out there who are thinking about running is, can we build strong local party organizations and run serious election campaigns? The Greens do run some campaigns, but too many of them, they're just mailing it in, to get on the ballot and do a little bit. They're not serious campaigns. And in a lot of cases, we're not running candidates at all. So there's a lot more we could do. We have to step it up. The climate crisis, the new nuclear arms race, and the growing inequality that is a life or death issue for the people that are at the low end of the income and benefit scale. For all of us and those issues, we're running out of time. So that's an appeal for us to start looking now at the next election cycle, if we're not already in an election now, and build our organizations and get out there and fight for change because, it's not going to come from the Democrats. That's really clear. And before I wrap up, I want to make a book recommendation. This is a book by Kim Mooney called Breaking the Impasse, Electropolitics, Mass Action, and the New Socialist Movement in the United States. And if you read this book, you will get a detailed description of some of the things I was talking about, like we can compete in these one-party districts. The spoiler problem is really not an issue there. He spends a lot of time showing why the strategy of the Democratic Socialists of America and the other progressive Democratic groups of trying to run primaries in the Democratic Party, assuming it's open. He makes the argument, and I think very convincingly, given the money, the apparatus of the Democratic Party that's funded by that money, the primaries are not that open to the left in the Democratic Party. Whereas the general election is more open because we can run in these one-party districts and just run a race straight to the general election without having to fight inside the Democratic Party. So it's a very good critique of what DSA and those other groups are doing. And, the basic point is we're not really going to have a mass party on the left until we have a mass movement. And he's looking to labor. And that's another issue that needs to be discussed. But I think, yes, labor has to be part of it. But there are other movements out there. A lot of people are not workers, but they have issues. They may be in, the working class in terms of their families, but they themselves are not workers. So what that mass movement looks like is another topic for discussion. But in just terms of understanding how our political system really works, I'm going to put this up here again, see if I get it there. I urge you to read this book, if I can get it where you can see the whole thing. Here you go. It's well worth a read. It'll give you a much deeper understanding in detail about, how the political system is closed, the Democratic Party is closed, but how we really have the opportunity to build an independent political movement. So I'm urging us to do that. So I'll stop there and I'll look for your questions and comments. Santino M., do you think the current inflation crisis will hurt progressive socialist electability chances in the future? Although Biden is a conservative neoliberal, he is often painted as a socialist. Yeah, that's what the right wing says about Biden. And, anybody who's not a conservative is a socialist in their mind. And we just have to explain why that's nonsense. I don't know whether the inflation hurts progressives and socialists depends on whether the Republicans can pin the blame on us. And also, some prominent Democrats like Lawrence Summers, who's calling still for higher interest rates from the Fed and high unemployment as high as 6%, even though if you look at it, it's not a wage price spiral that is inflation. It's an issue of supply chains that, coming out of COVID, and the energy crisis that is the underlying force of driving inflation, along with monopolistic corporations taking advantage of inflation to jack up their prices and price gouge and earn excess profits. And so antitrust or socialization of corporations, building out quickly the renewable energy sector so we're not dependent on the oil and gas barons and their price gouging, which we need to do for climate reasons as well as economic reasons. And where there are commodities that are crucial, we should look at price controls like we did during World War II so that people can afford what they need, like rent control. Or you could have a state fuel corporation that could wholesale all the oil and gas in the state at a price that the retailers could not mark up more than a certain level, so that you limit the prices of those things, so you're protecting everyday consumers. There are a lot of things we could do. And so we need to turn the debate around on, the Larry Summers of the world and the Republicans who want to blame inflation on public spending. Public spending, there's a op-ed, or not op-ed, a press release we just put out in New York State for our gubernatorial campaign that said public goods and services are the pocketbook answers we need for inflation. And maybe we can get the link to that in the chat so people can look at it. But the basic point is it's economically more efficient to provide things like healthcare, education, childcare, housing through the public sector at cost, not cost plus profit plus bureaucracy, when you have a mix of public and private providers like we do in the healthcare system and we do in the childcare system. And then we try to subsidize healthcare and childcare with these complicated formulas. So you get a whole lot of people doing paperwork and filling out applications and making grant proposals instead of directly funding these things at much lower costs in terms of bureaucratic overhead. I mean, there are a lot of reasons. There it is. It's in the chat. Take a look at that. We go through several areas. I guess I mentioned most of them. I could have added broadband, where we can provide it better, more inclusively, and economically more efficiently through the public sector instead of through the market with these private-seeking corporations trying to gouge the system and always appealing for subsidies so they can provide their service to lower-income people. And it just costs more and doesn't reach everybody. So those are pocketbook answers to pocketbook issues of inflation. So I think that's another thing. There's a lot of things we could do, but we've got to present our own case, or otherwise, inflation is going to get pinned on the quote unquote left, the Democrats in this case, but they call the Democrats socialists. And then they're going to use that to say we can't have public services. And we can't have, liberals in office or socialists in office because they create inflation, which is nonsense. So that's a political debate we got to engage in and win the argument with the general public. Scout Trooper 164, what do you think of the Federal Reserve increasing the prices of mortgage rates? Yeah, they do that indirectly by increasing the basic rate of that they loan money for. And I think it's not fighting inflation. It's making it harder for people to get mortgages, in other words, buy homes. It's going to increase unemployment, which is going to mean less people can buy homes. And we have inflation in housing because we don't have enough of it. We need more affordable rental housing. And right now what's happening is these big Wall Street private equity firms, they've been doing this since the Great Recession in 2008. They've been buying up housing that and homes that people could not afford, or they got underwater on their mortgage and had to give them up. And so they're buying them up, and they are now the biggest landlords in the country, and they're raising rents way above what it really costs to provide those units of housing. So that's why, and this is in our press release for the state, we need a social housing program, a state level public housing program. It doesn't say this in the press release, but under Clinton and my old buddy that I ran against, I say that sarcastically, Andrew Cuomo, when he was head of HUD, they had Congress pass a thing called the Faircloth Amendment, which says we can't build any more federally funded public housing. And any new units that are built have to replace old units that were torn down. So what we say is that if we have more public housing, and states can do this at the state level, we call it a social housing program, just to draw a little distinction from the federal public housing program. If we build that out and create enough affordable units so that everybody has an affordable option, then the private rental market is going to have to compete with that public housing, and it's going to bring rents down across the board. So those are some of the things we can do for inflation, and raising interest rates is not going to cut inflation. It's inflating the cost of credit, and that's passed on to other commodities. So, their theory that, well, it'll raise unemployment and then the wage price spiral will break. That's not what's going on. Real wages are not increasing at the rate of inflation, less than the rate of inflation. So real wages are going down. That's not what's driving prices up. It's supply shortages, supply chain problems, and particularly energy costs, which underlie a lot of items we end up buying. So there are other answers to inflation, and raising interest rates is not the answer. Scout Trooper 164. Also, Howie, do you believe China could enter an economic collapse with issues such as food and energy sources, bad housing market, etc.? I think the biggest threat they face is ecological. I mean, this heat wave they had this summer, the rivers drying up, that's what climate change is going to bring to China. It's one of the most vulnerable countries, particularly their food producing areas. The bad housing market, yeah, they went into capitalism big time with a lot of speculation. The government has tried to pull that back some, but it's created problems, like people pre-bought apartment buildings, which now can't be built, and they're trying to get their money back, and they're out there protesting for that. So, yeah, China does have definite economic problems, and economies are complex. China does have a measure of state planning and control and state enterprises, which can mitigate what's going on in the private market with its speculation and boom and bust. But I think the worst problem they face is ecological. And hopefully they can handle it. They did a pretty good job, or have done a pretty good job, in reducing the air pollution, which was deadly in cities like Beijing, by shutting down coal plants near the city and going more to renewables, although they are still building a lot of coal plants outside of the urban areas. So their overall contribution to global warming is still the highest in the world at this point. So, that's the best I can tell you. There are a lot of factors at play. I haven't made a close study to predict whether or when they will collapse, or what, how deep the collapse will be. But they're definitely, having problems, and their rate of growth has slowed down. And but like I said, I think underlying it is the ecological problems. If the river's dry and their agriculture is problematic, you're going to have, serious problems. Emil Sachs. Hi, Howie. Any thoughts on Biden quelling the railroad strike because he doesn't want unrest before the elections? Do the rail workers have any recourse when their own leadership is in Joe's pocket? Well, we're going to find out by about October 10th or 15th, because the railroad workers have to vote on his contract. And from what I've been able to gather, the contract does not deal with one of their biggest beefs with the railroad companies, and that is that they're on the scheduling issue. they're basically on 24/7 call, and they have to show up to work on 2 hours notice, which can totally, wreck any family plans, any, leisure time, recovery. And then they could call back for long, uh, work shifts that can go for 7 days or more, and often for, much more than 8 hours. And so they wanted the scheduling improved. And they have this point system, whereas if you don't respond when you're called, which means you got to be checking your phone all the time, you get points deducted. You get a certain number of points deducted, and I think you get suspended for a certain number of days. And then there's a second level, and the third level is you're terminated. And they're really pissed off about that. So, we'll have to see whether they accept what they got in this proposed contract, or whether they're going to vote it down and say go back and fix that scheduling issue and any other issues they may have with the contract. So yeah, of course Biden wanted to, not have a railroad strike, which is, they're pretty essential to our economy. 30-40% of goods are shipped on the rails. And if that doesn't happen, the economy has a lot of problems. And you don't want that right before an election. Excuse me, but the workers are going to have the last say on that contract vote. And that doesn't mean they're going to go right out on strike. They'll probably have another cooling off period, more negotiations. So it is pushed past the election. But I don't think, I wouldn't be surprised if the railroad workers vote down this contract, and the struggle continues. Andy Messick, in my current public policy courses, it is clearly a pro-capitalist, anti-socialist curriculum that claims rent control and public services don't work. What are some good books to read in order to answer these questions in hopes of changing some minds? Oh boy, there's some good books, and I can't remember the titles right now, that look at public services versus private delivery. And the best I can tell you is to Google and look for those books, particularly from socialists in the United Kingdom. This is something that they tend to study. I know that Yulia Yushchenko, the Ukrainian political economist I had on here, she's right now in the middle of a study comparing privatized versus public services, which is a big issue in Ukraine because the Zelensky government is neoliberal, and they're encouraged in that direction by the EU and Western imperialism. And so she's trying to document that Ukraine and any country would be better off with public services. But that's a study in progress. So I'm just thinking if I could, dig up some. If you look at my Twitter feed, by tomorrow night, I will have a tweet about some good resources on that. So look there, and there are definitely books out there that document it. And the basically pro-capitalist curricula you get in college, even high school, they make it like the market is the only thing that can deliver the goods to people. And they'll argue, for example, on rent control. Well, you do rent control, then private developers won't build housing because they can't make as much money. Yeah, but if you do it through the public sector, you can build that housing at cost and get more housing. So, and that rent control is regulation, not public ownership. So that's another distinction to keep in mind. But we need reasonable regulation, and we need a much more vital public sector if people are going to have their basic needs met. Richard Pink. John Kerry says, government does not have enough money to fight global warming. Should the Greens Party merge with the MMT, Modern Monetary Theory movement? I didn't hear Kerry say that, but the government revenues is not enough. I mean, we're either going to have to borrow the money, which MMT is, you're borrowing the money and you're going to pay it back in the end. The MMT argument is the debt can be serviced in most cases until you get up to the point where productive capacity is running at a maximum, and then you face problems of inflation. And we're not there at this point. Some people think MMT basically means you can just create money and it's free, and that's not really the truth. So, we do have to spend now to fight climate change with money we don't yet have. But the thing is, when we build this renewable energy infrastructure across all sectors of the economy, not just power production, but manufacturing, agriculture, buildings, and industry. What did I leave out? Buildings and agriculture. What we're going to do is lower the cost of energy, which means because we're not buying fuels, oil and gas primarily, because the sun shines and the wind blows, that energy is already there. We're just setting up the infrastructure to capture that energy and put it into the grid. And then the other thing is, if this is done through the public sector, then the revenues will come back to the public sector, paying for your electricity, paying for your public housing. If we're going to provide green machinery that is powered by renewables and built with materials that can be recycled, so you have a circular economy, zero waste, as close as we can get to that as possible. And the government is building that. They're either selling or leasing that to factories and farms. That brings in revenue. So the point is that we're going to have to borrow the money to get this stuff done now when we need to, because we're in an emergency, a crisis. But over time, it'll pay for itself. Like any good investment, it pays off in the end. And that's the way we have to look at it. So, I would just caution against thinking MMT tells us we can just print the money and spend it, and it doesn't cause inflation and it won't cost us anything. Under current law, you've got to, bond for that money, and you got to pay back the bondholders. The Greens do have a proposal for a monetary authority inside the Treasury Department that can create greenbacks like we did, during the Civil War and for many years afterwards. It was a whole movement, the Greenback Labor Party and the populist movement advocated that. But the thing there is, you create the money, it has to go into productive capacity. Otherwise, you will create inflation. So you spend it through the federal budget, and that federal budget can, build those public assets that benefit the whole economy. And that's a little different than modern monetary theory. So you can really get into the weeds on monetary theory. I think I'll just stop right there. Mr. Anderson, have you heard of the referendum in Cuba on the new family code? I need to look into it, but it sounds like a great law. I have not looked into it. I haven't even heard of the referendum. But Cuba, I have criticisms of their political system. It's not democratic. You can't form opposition parties. If you don't toe the party line, you can end up being called a dissident and, be sanctioned, imprisoned. But their social policies are good. Their healthcare system, their education system. And I would be surprised if a new family code, which I imagine maybe liberalizes divorce, ensures children are taken care of. I have to look at it, but in that respect, they do put forward good policies. So I'll need to look into it. It's the best I can say. Vicki Corden, what do you think of Republicans trying to rewrite the Constitution? Yeah, they want to make it so they want to take away our rights. It's a terrible idea. We do need to rewrite the Constitution so we get rid of things like, the Electoral College and the U.S. Senate, which are anti-majoritarian, elitist institutions. We could put more rights into the Constitution explicitly, like, the right to reproductive freedom and abortion, like the right to clean air and water and a sustainable environment. These are things that other countries are putting into their constitutions. Ours was written in the late 18th century, the 1700s, and it definitely needs an update. But the Republicans have other things in mind. They want to lock us in the 18th century, and even worse. So, yeah, I think we got to watch that and not let them. As I understand it, they've got a number of states have called for the Constitutional Convention, and they need a few more to have it happen. And they're well organized to take advantage of it. And the left progressives are not. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on, and maybe get prepared to fight over. Scout Trooper 164, what do you think of workers revolting after Home Depot did a stock buyback? So they're mad that the company spent money on a stock buyback instead of their wages and benefits, I imagine. I saw the headline. I didn't read the stories. And I think it's good that they're revolting. I mean, Home Depot is one of these, franchise large companies that don't have a unionized workforce. And the fact that they're revolting, hopefully, is a step toward forming a union and getting a collective bargaining contract so they can have a better deal and have a say over how Home Depot spends its profits. Stock buybacks are just about benefiting the stockholders, and particularly the top executives of these companies, whose compensation is largely based on the price of stocks. And when you buy back stocks, you create higher demand, it raises the price. So that's very self-serving on the part of the top management of companies like Home Depot and all the rest that are doing these stock buybacks. Steve Talbot, if an industry is moving towards automation and company leaders say that they will upskill their workers so they aren't left behind, does that make it okay? And should we believe them? Well, I think you got to look at the particulars of a company. I know the Longshoremen's Union, as they automated shipping with container shipping at the ports, got a pretty good deal where a lot of the efficiencies and the profits from those efficiencies went to the workers. And of course, they had to upskill because now they were operating machinery, from computer consoles instead of using their hands and their back to lug cargo around. So that was part of the deal, and it's worked out pretty good for the longshoremen. Now the total number of people working in that industry declined. So the guys that were already in it did well, but fewer were able to get in and do well. And so upskilling, does that make it okay? I would say in the larger picture, yes, because just using the example of the ports and the longshoremen, they were saving their bodies from wearing out before they got to old age. And should we believe them? No, not just off the cuff. We got to, look at the details and verify anything they say for ourselves. And that's why we got to have, transparency on these deals, not just take their word for it. Scout Trooper 164, Howard, I saw a video where the military is having a recruiting problem with vets in the comments section saying part of it is due to toxic leadership. What are your thoughts? Yeah, we do have examples of toxic leadership. I think it depends on the service. Depends on who the commanding officers are. But definitely, a lot of people are not re-enlisting because they got mistreated during their tour. So that would be a problem with toxic leadership. The soldiers should have a union. I mean, when I was in the Marine Corps, I was a member of the American Servicemen's Union, which, theoretically was trying to get a, collective bargaining agreement with the Pentagon, like at that time the Dutch soldiers had. I remember that. Uh, but it was more of an anti-war and war resistance organization. So never got to the point of really organizing for collective bargaining. But, soldiers should have that. And a lot of countries do have soldiers' unions. And that's a way to deal. So you have, like you do in a collective bargaining agreement with other companies or other institutions, you have a grievance procedure. And so if a officer is mistreating uh, the people he's leading, you have a process for dealing with that. Now, the military supposedly has that, but uh, a lot of times that's biased toward the leadership, and they cover up a lot of stuff. I think with a collective bargaining agreement and some rules about transparency and uh, neutral arbitration in cases and things like that, they could get a much bigger deal, much better deal. But I think the military recruiting problem is more than just toxic, abusive leadership. I think it's that fewer people in our country want to go into the military as a career choice. They look at other industries and think that's a better career choice. So maintaining a professional army without a draft, you got to make the army and the rest of the military attractive to people. And, they've done that with offers of, benefits. But another thing is if we start providing, say, tuition-free public college, for a lot of people, that's why they go in the military, to get those GI benefits. And if they can get to college without that, a lot of them are not going to go into the military. So that's another problem that the military faces in terms of recruiting. And of course, another thing that can be said is the military is way too big to protect this country. I called for military spending cuts on the order of 75%. And for me, that's like the first cut. We get down to 75% and then, have negotiations with other countries around the world to see if we can keep cutting further in, mutual disarmament and demilitarization. And, the problem is we're using our military to make the world safe for exploitation by global corporations, particularly those based in the US. And that's not about defending you and me. That's about defending the very rich people in this country who own most of the corporate stock and bonds. So military shouldn't have a recruiting problem because it shouldn't be that big. Mr. Anderson, should municipalities have more autonomy from state governments? In Mississippi, Jackson cannot change its taxes without getting approval from the state government. Yeah, it should have more autonomy and more funding from state government. There should be revenue sharing because the state can do a broad-based tax. If you try to raise that money municipally, you get in tax jurisdiction competition, a race to the bottom where different municipalities are cutting taxes in order to attract business, and then they end up with no revenues. And businesses don't really make the decisions on that anyway. They just kind of blackmail communities when they say they're ready to move in, but they'll do things like say, well, this other place we're looking at, they're willing to give us a tax break. Can you match that? And so they, communities need the economic activity, so they tend to cave into that kind of pressure. We got to get out of that. And so I think you need it where states or municipalities have home rule on the taxes that those people want to impose on themselves. And, state government shouldn't be telling them, in that case, what they can or cannot do. And a lot of times the state government doesn't want them to do that, like an income tax. A lot of states have an income tax. They don't want municipalities adding to it. There are a lot of states that do have municipal income taxes, including conservative states. I think Kentucky's one of them. Indiana's another. In New York, where I live, you have to get state permission. So New York City and Yonkers have permission. But, when I've run for public office here in New York and Syracuse, I've argued for let's have a progressive income tax When I ran for mayor in 2017, I said 0% up to 50,000, a 0.5% up to 100,000, and 1% over 100,000 income. And that would have raised a lot of money. And then we not only enough money to provide good public services, but also to cut the property tax, which tends to be regressive, or the sales tax, which in this case is both state and county implemented. The state, I think, is 4%, and the counties can go up to that. They do have to get state permission, but a lot of them are up to, an additional 4.5%. So it's 8.5% sales tax, which is the most regressive tax of all. So, I generally think municipalities should be able to have the taxes they want, progressive income tax, a land value tax, things like that. You could have a land value tax is a more progressive property tax, where you tax the underlying land value, but not the improvements you make on it, which encourages dense urban development, not sprawl. And you don't have speculators sitting on land in urban areas. It just adds to the decay of urban areas until they can be redeveloped and gentrified. I mean, there's a lot of things to speak for it. So, yeah, municipalities should have more autonomy, particularly on financing their public finances with taxes. Scout Trooper 164, Howie, you were right. Putin called up 300,000 troop draft, and protests are in a mass. I guess you mean mass protests. This will likely not help him sooner or later. Is there more? There's a comma there, not a period. But yeah, it's hard to tell. And I, look at sources, Russian, Ukrainian, official sources on both sides, people who post on Telegram and other forums. But in Russia, Telegram is about the last platform that people can post and get it out. And it looks like, the difference between Ukraine and Russian militaries is Ukrainians are motivated. They're defending their land, their families, their country. And the Russians are an occupation force. And a lot of them wonder what the hell they're doing there. A lot of them were draftees in a military exercise. And next thing you know, they're headed into Ukraine to fight the Ukrainians. And now, geez, you look at some of this stuff coming on Telegram and even Russian state media. And, people are showing up. They're veterans disrespecting the officers that are trying to get them to line up. They're bringing carts of vodka and beer. They don't seem very enthusiastic. And we do get reports that they're emphasizing recruitment in the poor rural areas of eastern Siberia and in the south and the Caucasus, ethnic minorities, not so much the Russian and the Russian people in Russia. There's a figure I haven't verified, but if it's true, it's really astounding in that while, based on an internal document from Russia, they had over 50,000 casualties a couple months ago. Some say over 80,000. And that was with an invasion army that originally was 150, 200,000. That's enormous. That is real attrition. But in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the richer urban cosmopolitan areas, there are only 11 Russians who were casualties of the war, according to this report. If that's true, it really shows how that's a poor people's draft and mobilization in Russia, which in the long run is not going to, increase the stability of Russia. So I think, they have real problems, and this war is undermining their stability. I listened to the Ukrainians watching the Russians protest, and they're complaining, why can't the Russians be like the Iranians, who have now rose up against the murder of that Kurdish woman for not wearing her hijab properly? And they're out there, they're throwing firebombs, burning down government buildings. They're rioting. And the Ukrainians are saying that's what the Russians need to do to stop the war. So, I'm just reporting what I've heard and observed. But I think Russia is in trouble. I mean, some analysts say they're just not combat ready. They're falling apart, and that's really what happened in Kharkiv, where the Ukrainian offensive, grabbed, depends on who you read, between 2,000 and 4,000 square miles. It took, according to the Institute for War, the Russians all summer to get 175 square miles in the Donbass. And then they lost, let's say 3,000 square miles in 5 days in Kharkiv to the north. And if you look at the whole war, the maximum Russian advance, they've lost 17,500 square miles before the Kharkiv thing. So it's over 20,000 square miles of land. And over the summer, only gained 175. So the war effort for Russia is not going very good. Now, of course, the price to the Ukrainians, we don't have a good take on, how many casualties have they had? They seem to be better, have been better at keeping it to themselves. And, the Russians make a lot of claims in, their state media, but, it's hard to trust what they say in that, regarding Ukrainian casualties. So, yeah, it's not a good situation over there. When Putin had his speech about the partial mobilization, there's a paragraph in there where it looks like he's ready to negotiate on the terms that Zelensky proposed back in the end of March, which were Ukraine would be neutral, non-NATO, non-nuclear, and have no foreign troops. Now, it's already in the Ukrainian constitution that they are non-nuclear and will allow foreign troops to be based there. It is in the constitution they want to join NATO. That would have to change. And then in addition, they would decide the fate of Lugansk, Donbass, and Crimea by diplomacy, not war, basically leading to, a referendum on status that was really democratic and allowed everybody who had lived there to return and vote, in a free and fair election. And the Russians rejected it at the time in early April. Lavrov and then Putin just dismissed it. But in his speech, Putin, claiming it was the Russian proposal, said, something like, we're ready to talk about that, which seemed to be a hint that, maybe now Ukrainians could put that back on the table. On the other hand, they're so mad at the Russians for all the atrocities and bombing civilians and civilian infrastructure and the war crimes that, they're now saying, yeah, let's have a ceasefire, Russia withdraw, and then we'll negotiate how we'll have a security arrangement between the two countries so we don't go to war again. So anyway, I think the U.S. government should be probing and encouraging them to talk about, a peace settlement without, demanding that what the Ukrainians are, should concede or not. And just try to open that up. And one thing that, says that may be possible is not only the casualties on both sides, but the fact that they just negotiated a prisoner exchange. And before that, the enabling of ships with Ukrainian grain to get out of the port of Odessa to world markets. So they are talking, and hopefully that will lead to peace negotiations. The problem is Putin, he don't want to admit defeat, and the Ukrainians don't want to give up land. They're mad as hell at the Russians for invading them. So it's a difficult situation. Thoughts on the Russian-ran referenda in the occupied regions? Well, again, look at what you can find on Telegram or even Russian state media. And you've got people carrying ballot boxes that are transparent. You can see. So when you put your ballot in, You can see who you voted for or what you voted, for, joining Russia or not. That's all it's on the ballot, yes or no. And these people are carrying them around with armed guards. So they knock on your door and they say, vote. And if you don't vote the right way, people are afraid if they don't vote the right way, they have their name, they know how they voted, and they'll come back for them for being dissidents. So this is not any way fair. Even the Crimea thing, where it's reasonable to think there were a lot of ethnic Russians in Crimea said they did want to join the Russian Federation, even though there hadn't been a separatist movement until Yanukovych left and the Russian troops went into Crimea and they had to snap a referendum. But that referendum, it was a joke. You had 20% more people voting in Sevastopol, the biggest city, the port city where the Russian warships are, than there are voters in that city. That's what they reported. So it was a farce. And this is even more farcical when you see, either carrying the ballot boxes around or at the polling places. There are big boxes. They're like glass boxes. You can see what the ballot says. That's not a fair election. That's not a secret ballot. It's a joke. And we all know what the result will be. They'll vote to join Russia, and then they're going to say, oh, now that you're fighting us, it's Russian territory, not Ukrainian territory. You're attacking Russia. So that means we can defend our existence. And Putin has hinted with tactical nukes. I don't think he's going to do that. That would, militarily, it doesn't make any sense because the Ukrainian forces are dispersed. They're in small units across the front line. It's 1,000 miles. It would be more symbolic than, a tactical advance. So, and of course, he doesn't know, what the response from the West would be. So I don't think that's going to happen. But they do have, other weapons. They've used these hypersonic missiles. They got the, of course, the cluster bombs and the, what do they call them? They're high. Phosphorus is another one, and then they got, I forget the name of it. I want to say barbaric, but there's a word for it. They produce a lot of fire, and they are also questionable on law of war grounds. But and they are just taking out all the Ukrainian infrastructure, so they don't have electricity and heating for this winter coming up. I mean, Russia can do all that. That would have more impact than nukes. So I don't think they're going to use nukes. And this referendum is part of laying the basis, the rationale for doing those kind of barbaric military tactics. So it's not a good situation. Scout Trooper 164, what do you think of Biden committing to war if China tries to take Taiwan? Yeah, Biden is putting fuel on the fire. He didn't need to do that. The historic policy of the U.S. is we recognize Taiwan as part of China, one country, two systems. And what we would do if China invaded Taiwan, we leave ambiguous, called strategic ambiguity. Biden removed the ambiguity, which just basically is given fuel to the hawks on the Chinese side. And it escalated the conflict. Biden is a effing idiot. He just should keep his mouth shut. He says stuff like this when he's not scripted. And I think his inner gut is very hawkish, although when he's, has to think about it and look at the policy, they come out more balanced. But I think that was a terrible thing for him to say, particularly at a time like this when we got a crisis in Ukraine. Steve Talbot, I recently saw a video that explained how France maintains strong ties with its former West African colonies, extracting wealth while holding people down. How can we stop colonial exploitation? Well, we need to support the anti-colonial forces in these countries. The problem is because of neocolonialism that we're talking about here, there are a lot of comprador elites that cooperate with the countries like France that exploit those resources. So, imperialism is basically going to end when those of us on the left in the imperialist countries shut down our imperialist policies, which means, first of all, military presence, and second of all, the multilateral institutions that manage global capitalism, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization and the World Bank. I mean, the International Monetary Fund, all the imperialist countries use that as a multilateral way to manage the dominance of Northern finance capital over the exploited countries of the South. And, China is the second biggest investor and voter in the IMF. And they, along with the US and most of the BRICS, what is that? Brazil, Russia, India, China, they share multilateral management of a neoliberal system where they put austerity, privatization, deregulation, conditionalities on loans to countries that are in fiscal distress. So they change the policies of those countries, and then they make them pay it back with interest. And that is economic imperialism. It's extracting economic surplus from the colonized or neo-colonized countries. So we've got to change, basically capitalism. You're not going to get rid of colonialism and imperialism in a capitalist system because it's an expansionist system and inevitably has countries trying to expand their reach for their corporations so they can get cheap labor, markets for their products, material, natural resources at a cheap price in these other countries. And so that's the system. It's a global system of imperialism. There's a hierarchy of imperialist countries. The U.S. is the most powerful, but you have Russia, you have China, you have Turkey, you have Iran in their own spheres of influence, in some cases globally. So we're not going to defeat it by supporting one imperialist power, say Russia or China, against the U.S. We got to have people in all these countries fighting their own imperialists and pushing for a green socialism where we have democracy and peace instead of capitalism where we have competition and war. So we need system change and we need solidarity with basically the left, the socialist movements, particularly the ecological socialist movements that are fighting this. In Latin America, we had the pink tide, but they tended to be pro-extraction social democrats. Whether it's Maduro or Correa in Ecuador, and they've had resistance from the indigenous-led anti-extractivist movements that said we need an ecological socialism that isn't dependent on extracting oil, gas, and hard minerals and destroying our environments. We need a development that builds on renewable energy, organic agriculture, and sustainability. So that's a whole nother dimension of this anti-colonial struggle, because it's also a struggle against extractivism, which in Africa, and depends on the country, but Central African Republic, a lot of mineral extraction there in some of the former French colonies. So we need to be in solidarity with those movements in those countries that are fighting it, and then fight our own imperialists at the same time. Okay, we've been going an hour, and I appreciate the discussion. There's so much to say going on in the international situation. Next week, I'm going to have a doctor named Claire Cohen, who is the leader in the movement for a socialized medical system, not just single-payer healthcare, socializing the insurance, but socializing the whole system, because the corporations have now taken over the hospitals and the delivery system. And she's a Green out of Pittsburgh. And so we're going to talk about that. She's also a psychiatrist. We may talk about some of the underlying causes of mass shootings and just the general high degree of violence in this country. So I hope you'll be here next week to hear what Claire has to say. And so I'll sign off here, and hope you all have a good week. And like I said at the top, we really need to organize a movement, because if we leave it to the Democrats and Republicans, we're toast. So have a good week.